You're listening to the Otis Jiry channel.
Chapter 9. Dr. Davenport. On the way down to his lab, Mark's only thoughts were to contact Jane as soon as possible to tell her how it all went and that his boss was coming over that very evening. He found her in the ENT department, where she had moved on to as part of her overall training. She was grabbing a hurried cup of coffee in the staff room before her next port of call in another part of the building. "Another minute and you would have missed me," she said between noisy slurps. "Listen, I've told old Carlston everything and how you've helped me, and he's coming over this evening to see the evidence. How are you fixed?" Jane looked over her shoulder to see if the rest of her team had moved on. "I'm on until 9 tonight, but there is a chance I may get away early. Look, sorry, Mark, I really must rush. I'll see you this evening, all right?" Mark returned to his lab, sat down, and reflected on the conversation with his boss, trying to recall every word which was spoken to finally convince himself that he'd done the right thing. Deep in thought, the jangle of the telephone returned his mind abruptly to the present. Grabbing the handset, he automatically announced himself. "Hello, Granger here." It was Carlston. "Mark, I've just been in contact with a good friend of mine. He works at the ministry. He's in the same line of research as yourself, but more in the psychology field. I hope you don't mind, but I invited him to our little get-together this evening. He's really most interested. You should get on well together." Mark was furious, in utter disbelief that after all they had spoken of less than a half-hour ago, there was Carlston shouting it from the rooftops. It was something he took mistakenly for granted that the conversation was in total confidence, and within minutes there he was telling someone else. He couldn't hide his anger, and after a lengthy silence he answered Carlston. "Look, I'm terribly sorry, but our conversation was just between ourselves. I just don't want anyone else involved at this stage. I thought you realized the importance of that. You will, with respect, cancel this friend of yours with a suitable excuse. I won't have others involved. I'm sorry, but that's how it must be." The anger and desperate disappointment in Mark's tone came across the phone line, loud and clear. "I'll remind you, Granger, that you work in this establishment for me. The research you've done is a part of the whole department's work and not your personal property. I commend you for this effort, which I hope to see the results of this evening. With your permission, that is. I will do as you ask, and come alone." Mark calmed his voice as best he could, but could not stop himself shaking inside. "Please, if you would. This is very important to me, and 90% of this project is being undertaken in my own time, in my own flat. That, to me, makes it my personal work. I'm sorry if you just don't see it that way, but that's how it is, and that's how it'll stay. I hope you will appreciate that tonight. Goodbye." Mark stopped himself from slamming down the phone, only just, as his finger stabbed on the rest button. Then he slammed it down, fury having taken hold of his senses. It was Carlston himself who asked if anyone else knew about this work, and then sets about inviting his friend to his flat. The evening arrived all too quickly, and at just after 7, the bell sounded in the kitchen. With a mouthful of sandwich, he answered the door to Carlston, his shiny silver BMW looking totally out of place in push-bike bedsit land. "Do come in." Carlston stepped into the small hall area as Mark closed the door behind him and leaned upon it, still clutching the old-fashioned brass knob. "Look, I'm sorry I was somewhat rude on the phone, but really, this thing is bigger than both of us," Mark said firmly. "I do hope this gadgetry of yours lives up to your vivid description of it." A half-smile formed on his lips, but his eyes didn't respond. It was always an annoying feature of Carlston. You could never be sure of his mood or what he might be thinking. It was definitely a result of his fixed eyes never changing, even when you think he's making a joke. The machines were switched on, and Mark explained each function along the way. He first showed him how the EEG readings were digitized to be introduced to the computer, with his program forming the video signal necessary to be fed to the monitor. Mark then ran a series of video recordings he'd made of the important scenes, the ones which took days and even weeks to locate as clear as possible to make visual sense. Carlston was staggered. He just couldn't believe what he was seeing. Mark proved to him their authenticity by going right back to a particular scene, shown to be faithfully extracted from an original EEG trace recording, and on through the chain of devices, including his control device he used to slow down the rushes of images generated in the patient's brain. The final set of video recordings told the chilling story clear enough to convince anyone, even Carlston. Of course you realize what all this means, don't you, Mark? He spoke as if he'd been consulted for a decision on what it all meant. Mark, more than any of them, knew very well what it meant. Of course, answered Mark. The great problem arising is what to do with the knowledge and awesome content of this man's dreams and thoughts. This prototype experiment has been conducted on a far from ordinary person. He was murdered for what he knew, which is now what we know. The big question is whether the dreams of this man can be relied upon as fact. I am in no doubt that they are the true events in this man's recent past. We know from the witness report of the accident and from the injuries he received that he all but survived a hit-and-run assassination attempt. He goes over and over those few moments in his mind exactly as they were reported to have happened by the witness. I have this event repeated many times in the EEG data streams and recorded onto videotape, and still have many more REM data recordings to go through. There's a very strong possibility that new and different images remain to be recorded. The point is, Dr. Carlston, that if the car assassination attempt has remained clear in his mind for all this time, then it's probably fair to say that the other events in his memory mind's eye are just as likely to be based on actual, factual events. So there is every reason to believe that he did plant a nuclear bomb under the Kremlin. His boss sat there without a word. Well, what do you think? Are you as convinced as we are? Mark said as he turned his ear towards the door. It's Jane. She had to work late this evening. Mark opened the door, and there stood Jane, dripping wet from a sudden downpour. What he didn't expect to see was a man who, after shaking his umbrella, proceeded up the steps behind Jane. They appeared to have arrived together. "Jane, who is this guy with you?" he demanded. Jane looked startled at Mark's response. "He's a friend of Dr. Carlston, Dr. Davenport, I think you said, didn't you?" She turned to him for acknowledgement. "Yes, that's right. I only hope you will understand why I had to see you as soon as possible this evening, while Dr. Carlston was present." He was a diminutive figure of a man, sniffing because of the rain and fumbling for a handkerchief. Mark turned on Carlston, who had come up behind him. "I told you no one else. What is this? Who the hell can I trust?" He ushered Jane into the room and gestured for Carlston and his sniveling sidekick to leave. "You simply must listen to what Dr. Davenport has to say," Carlston blurted. "Clear off, both of you. This isn't a bloody open house, you know." Carlston pulled his friend out in the rain, sending Mark off balance and into the wall. "You've gone too far this time." He was about to pull a punch at one of them when Jane took a hold of his arm. She yelled at him. Mark, listen to me for a moment, please. It's okay. Really, it is." "How can you call this to be okay?" "I've just about had enough." Jane shouted at him to stop and listen to what Davenport had to say before anything else. Reluctantly, Mark went into the room, followed by Jane, with an arm on his shoulder. The other two men exchanged glances, then looked over towards Mark and Jane. It was Carlston who broke the tense silence. "Mark, it was my idea that Dr. Davenport here should approach Jane, underhanded as it may seem. He has explained the reason for insisting on speaking to you about your revelations, and Jane is in full agreement." Mark dumped himself into an armchair. "All right, then. Fire away. But it better be good, I'm warning you." The others sat down while Jane perched on the arm of Mark's chair, as if to reassure him that everything was all right. What was to follow, Mark certainly needed to know. Davenport told them that everything they had found out about the patient was true. In fact, it was the most remarkable piece of detective work that he had ever heard of, especially by devising such a machine as a dream recorder, a means by which the thoughts and dreams of anyone were there for the taking. He was able to tell them the patient's name, Nathan Fraser, an MI5 secret agent no less. Mark's jaw visibly dropped as Davenport continued his story. Fraser had been highly trained to carry out his mission, one which would have been cooked up by British and U.S. military intelligence. He had entered the Soviet Union as a visitor, and by careful planning by military strategists and Russian associates, was able to gain access to the underground conduit system of the Kremlin. The system, laid out for the purpose of servicing the piping and cable inputs and outputs of the complex. Fraser had successfully placed a trunk-size A-bomb in the very bowels of the Soviet Union's center of operations. A high-gain antenna was attached to the case by a cable to communicate coded signals with a geosynchronous satellite when the need arose. Davenport went on to say that once Fraser was back in England, he was to immediately travel to Cambridge to make contact with another agent for the purposes of debriefing. It was never meant to reach the debriefing agent. It was planned to kill him so he could never reveal the purpose of his mission to anyone. Enter Mark. Then Davenport came to the point. "You are in grave danger, both of you," he warned, turning to nod at Jane. "These people are ruthless and will stop at nothing to ensure they completely obliterate any evidence whatsoever. As you've seen, they swiftly eliminated Fraser. They had to. If this mission and its purpose was to ever leak back to the Soviets, can you imagine what that would mean in terms of world security? I personally consider this to be the ultimate act of gross stupidity, which could take the Cold War to the very brink of credibility and would be an actual declaration of war against this country and the USA." Dr. Davenport finally located his handkerchief from his soggy mackintosh pocket and proceeded to mop his forehead and neck. Not rainwater, but a profusion of sweat which had gradually formed rivulets down his cheeks and made their way to his collar. It was now obvious why the two men had to speak to Mark, and he felt bad about his earlier behavior, which at the time was entirely understandable. He apologized to them for this, which was anticipated to be a natural response on his part to protect the evidence he had accrued. Mark now had even more reason to keep his awful nightmare machine under control. No one else must find out what he had discovered or how. The time had come for Mark to seek advice about what he should do with the tapes. Now he knew that what they had revealed to him was solid, horrifying fact. There was no way Davenport could have known beforehand the exact details of the tapes. Then it occurred to him, how did this Davenport know the complete details of such a secret plan? Surely he must be in grave danger of the terminal type as well as himself. More so, in fact, because he obviously knew about it well before Mark stumbled upon it. He had to ask Davenport how he knew. Mark pulled himself up out of his thoughts in the armchair to look Davenport straight in the eyes. "I've got to know how you came across this information," demanded Mark. Jane nodded. Davenport stood up and struggled to remove his mackintosh. Jane helped him and took the coat into the kitchen. Everyone present had settled down into a sort of all-in-the-same-boat situation. Jane called from the kitchen to ask if anyone wanted tea as she lit the gas under the kettle. It was a welcome break for all of them. "Dr. Carlston and myself," began Davenport, "have known each other for a long time. Before he came to your hospital as head of neurosurgery and neurology, he was a member of our organization. I'm sure he won't mind me telling you that he was involved in research into the psychology of prospective secret agents, those who were to be considered as special agent material, if you follow what I mean. These potential undercover agents have to be very carefully vetted over a long period of time before they're approached and offered this work. The psychological makeup of such a person is of prime importance, and this was the task Dr. Carlson had undertaken within the organization. He and a small elite group of medical men had to get under the skin of these people, so to speak. They trace all activities and political proclivities since their birth. The parents' activities and country of origin has to be known for obvious reasons. Even their sexual preferences are scrutinized to avoid the possibility of blackmail. This vetting process can take many years to complete as thoroughly as is absolutely possible, you understand." Mark nodded. One such person was Nathan Fraser. Before being approached for the job he eventually undertook, he was carefully monitored for 7 years until virtually everything was known about him. A great deal of this work was done by Dr. Carlston until he left the organization 4.5 years ago. He was only allowed to move out of his position when it was sure that he would never speak of his work. He knew very well that if he did, he was a dead man. That was an absolute certainty. He also knew it was Fraser in his department's hospital bed. He had recognized him on admission. Dr. Carlston and I are risking our lives to find a way of saving yours, and that now includes Jane." Davenport looked over to where she was sipping her tea, his eyes damp with concern for the young couple's safety. "My God!" exclaimed Mark. "This is not true. It's a bloody nightmare. I'll wake up soon." "I'm sorry. I'm so terribly sorry things have turned out like this. Ironically, your wonderful invention has turned against you, and now we must make plans to save ourselves," he said, in a shaky voice. "It's not myself I particularly care for, but for you two, who should never have become involved in this awful murderous business. If the car accident had gone successfully to plan, none of this would have happened. So you're a member of this organization, are you? Am I bloody 5? The silence which followed confirmed it. Davenport was quite obviously ashamed of his involvement with this particular department, and looked a beaten, broken husk of a man who seemed determined to do something meaningful with his remaining years, or weeks. You see, vast sums of money are offered in this business, and it's only when you're older and wiser that you realize the money isn't the important factor. Fraser was offered a phenomenal sum of money, $5 million, I think the figure was, and a place in the sun for the rest of his miserable life. What he didn't know was that he would never live to enjoy it. It was all part of the overall plan, mainly masterminded by the Americans. It wasn't until he had completed the job that the order was made to snuff him out. Oh, the poor bastard. Davenport was pure spilling the beans as if he had nothing left to lose. The decision to plant the bomb was in case things got out of control, allowing Britain and America the upper hand, a sort of trump card which could be played as blackmail. One which the Russians couldn't risk calling their bluff, added Mark. That's about the long and short of it, Carlston interjected. Carlston and Davenport finally left in the small hours. Carlston gave his friend a lift, as Davenport had made his way that day by bus and walking from the railway station in the morning. He had boarded the first train from London after receiving Carlston's telephone call. The car pulled into the driveway of Carlston's house in the pretty satellite village of Little Shelford, a short distance from Addenbrooke's. Dr. Davenport was invited to stay overnight before catching the early morning train back to his London flat.